extracts from longer films, some trailers, some literally just 20, 30 seconds. So maybe quite choppy, and in a way I think we wanted that effect because we wanted to give a sense of the quite distracted way that probably a lot of us take in our media these days, and also to enhance that we also give ourselves the liberty, but in a way you could have it too, to step up while they're on and speak about how it relates to animation, how it relates to the themes we're working with tomorrow, which are histories, ghosts, technologies and infrastructures. So we're not treating these reverentially, obviously not, and most of these clips are grabbed from the internet anyway, and we're not showing 16mm film, great, good style copies. So we think we can treat them with a certain amount of license, so we may talk over them, and you may talk over them too, if you wish. So I think that's what I would say about the format for tonight. They're set in chronological order. That was just a way of putting them together, starting with Méliès and ending with something on femto photography from last year. So that's the kind of structure and format of what you're about to see. Okay. Eilish, do you want to say anything? Or?
No, that's all right. I'll save myself for tomorrow.
Should we put the lights down a bit
Yeah,
more?
we'll put the lights down, and just maybe say very briefly what the title and the artist this is a GIF. It's against the chronological order. It's a work from 2010. It's by Constant Dullard, titled Waving Ocean. A GIF. Okay. So we are back into history. The early work by Georges Méliès, French filmmaker. Le Voyage de la Lune, A Trip to the Moon from 1902. We watched the whole movie.
I don't know what others think of that, but I mean, for me, what's sort of anchored there in the in this kind of frivolity of animation is just how historically absorbent, I suppose, it looks. Just how much it's enmeshed in colonial tropes, and I suppose it raises that question that perhaps our notion of ghosts signifies, that if animation's an excessive liveliness, it's also there's death, sort of there's death in there. It raises the spectre of death. And I suppose one of the things that struck me about that though was that the human, all the life seems to be in the human parts, oddly, for animation. This sort of excessive movement that humans are involved in, and in some ways I was thinking of how these maybe Henry Rousseau-like landscapes on the moon just look so deadly theatrical, and they kind of don't have life. Or it seems to me now that they also have a kind of deadliness about them. But that was just something that
would that have been presented with music in its time?
Yeah, I get it would have had life.
It would have had an organ.
Yeah, which would have changed the sense of it, wouldn't it? Would have introduced more.
Yeah, it's too bad.
More life.
Well, this is Lotte Reiniger, an extract from Aladdin and the Magic Lamp from 1954.
The ancient city of Baghdad in Persia, many, many years ago. Aladdin was a poor tailor, and to him one day there came a stranger, a sorcerer. Come with me, come. You can have a palace like the Caliph himself. Look, the Caliph's daughter, Din Nazardin. To be your wife. Do what I ask. The sorcerer took Aladdin far up into the mountains and came to an old well. Ah, there is a lamp down in the cave. Fetch it. Fetch it. Fetch me the lamp. Down. You will not. Stay. No. Stay. Please. Stay there, ungrateful. Stay with only the lamp for company. Stay.
It's funny because we broke our own chronological rule with this being from 54, but I think it's right to say that Reininger doesn't really change her method at all, a method that she establishes in the late teens and early 20s. And I suppose it stands here interestingly in that, we now inhabit much more of a 3D animated world. And this is so emphatically 2D, colourless, weightless. It's referring back, I suppose, to also the oldest sort of notion of shadow play and puppetry, or even shadows on the wall of Plato's cave, and all of that. And in 1923, Walter Ruttmann, who was an experimental animator, was working with her on one of her films and became exasperated, said, what does this have to do with 1923, with inflation and politics and political strife and economic nightmares? And I suppose, I've tried to make the argument kind of elsewhere that in a sense it has a lot to do with a sort of flattening out of life and affect, and a loss of substantiality in a situation where nothing has stability anymore, in inflation, when the currency has become unanchored, which means in a capitalist society that everything's in a kind of free fall, and these fairy tales that seem almost so escapist as well as in some context orientalizing, can actually possibly be seen as kind of metaphors perhaps for a certain insubstantiality and evaporation that's occurring socially and politically.
From 1938, Disney's Mer Babies. Yeah, sorry.
Just thinking, it's interesting how much of that film's about air and bubbles, isn't it? And it's almost like that's a kind of recognition of the textbook 101 definition of animation as sort of breath or this life thing. And while watching that, I was thinking about Eisenstein's love of that and seeing anchored in Disney in a way this evolutionary sort of ascending kind of drive. So it's funny, there was a ladder in that film, as in the Reininger film, something about a kind of ascension in a way from the sea up to breathing the air and being on the land and development of humans and so on. The other thing I was thinking of was just how much at the beginning with the little merbabies floating around, how much of a model that is for Miyazaki's Ponyo, which begins very similarly with this shoal of fish, and then one baby fish breaks away and is going to go on to become a human. But Miyazaki kind of manages to anchor this kitsch and turn it into environmental parables, and goes to places that Disney didn't go and maybe tries to go now, but no one really believes that they really believe it, or I don't anyway.
There's also something about the disappearance of the bubbles at the end, how the mermaids disappear together with the bubbles in light of the Méliès puff of smoke. So there's an allegorical playing around the make-believe, the technologies, and the disappearance of those in a puff of smoke, quite literally also. I mean, there's also a way in which you can't see Disney anymore without thinking about the different tropes that resurface in every single Disney movie. The movement, the left alone, the stranded behind. I mean, the way in which Oliver Larrick has animated some of these in his versions works, identifying how Winnie the Pooh is the same sequence as is Mowgli in the Jungle Book and so forth. So there's also a repetition that I think we're both performing but also diagnosing here in these different tropes that come up, not so much as a genealogy necessarily, but simply as a recurrence of certain things we are allegoricizing, as well as they may also speak to an inherent, self-reflexivity of the medium, the way in which the circus comes up, some of the old 19th century motifs around animated technologies, if you think about the futurists, not just, but also the futurists and the surrealist fascinations with the circus as an iteration of technology that is purely in the service of spectacle and intensified experience, for instance. Some of these things play out both in the let's say, experiential and in the allegorical. And I think it's also interesting about these prehistories. To which extent that is always inherently in the material, or whether we now have to see it through that, I think is another question inherent to this notion of the history. How one tracks a history, how one retrospectively inscribes these things into a history of film, and of course how we select these things in a certain set of discussions also.
I was just going to say there's a certain excessiveness in the Merbabies film as well, because in the 1930s, Disney's practice was being, at this point, intensely scrutinized by their peers, and the number of shots per film was going up and up and up. And this film, the fluidity of the animation is kind of like self-reflexively commented upon, in that it's underwater, and you have this kind of like incredible kind of fecundity, like over-the-top fluidity running through everything. And as with several other films of this period, there's a sort of deep self-awareness. You've got the Fleischer Studio and these other studios kind of competing with Disney, and the Disney studio is responding by producing these incredible Baroque shorts that sort of take their motifs further and further.
Absolutely. And then also the real-life spectacle equivalents, water ballet, the kind of Hollywood productions of the time, which are both either draw on the same vocabulary or indeed are in competition here for attention in these productions. You couldn't make it up. It's overrich.
I think the point with surrealism is important as well. If you think about the surrealist exhibitions of the 1930s, the mermaid themes, the Seafoam Palace, and so on, those surrealist exhibitions are a point of interaction between the popular and the avant-garde. And Disney's own fascination with surrealism sort of comes out in that period quite strongly as well.
And I think it's a useful reminder as to our own preconception, because the pre-1950s, I think the distribution between mainstream Hollywood and what we now refer to as the divergent avant-garde is much more difficult and much more blurry. So there's the kind of post-50s understanding of Hollywood producing narratively organized feature films as a mainstream is a really particular moment when that kicks in. I mean, what surrealism and indeed futurism could draw on much more convincingly was an unboundedness of these spectacle events that didn't need to be appropriated in a subversive way. They were just ready for the taking. They were part of an expanded and shared field of what we now think as quirky versus surreal, possibly. Sorry.
Okay.
The next is Norman McLaren, Dots from 1940. Any comments?
I think it's kind of really interesting to put the three films together. Reiniger's Aladdin, wasn't it? The Disney Mermaids and Dots. Dots is scratched on the film itself, McLaren using the film strip. So he's using a whole other technique, and I think the sound is also scratched on the optical soundtrack there as well. So it's got he's using the animation or the materials of animation in a whole other way. He's starting with the film strip itself and working with the film strip rather than taking photographs, which is essentially what we see with the Disney process. And the other, I think, interesting thing about the three animations as well is the kind of very different process of working. The Disney is, as David was just saying, these were the Silly Symphonies were very spectacular pieces of short animation. But they were kind of experiments in a way, each animation. I think that was very much had a sense of being an experiment with water and the animation of water in some sense. But it's also a studio production where a huge amount of money is put into that production with a whole lot of people working on it. Whereas Reiniger is primarily working by herself, very much working on using that single technique of shadow animation with the cutout shapes. And then we've got McLaren, who again is an individual artist working alone, perfecting different styles of animation. Where, unlike Reiniger, I think Norman McLaren uses a whole range of different techniques. So there's three very different kind of examples of how to be an animator. You've got two individuals, but one very much focused on a single technique, the other exploring and experimenting with all the different possibilities of using sound and image. And at the same time, you've got a studio with a huge number of people who are again experimenting in this particular moment with their animation.
And the next piece is Isidore Isu, an extract from Venom and Eternity, an Electrist film from 1951. It's the whole movie is 111 minutes, so this is a very short part, but it's worth seeing the whole thing if you want a proper movie. I hope this works. It's a bit flaky. What do you do?
Maybe also just in terms of housekeeping, we will compile a growing archive, as it were, of these materials, at least as an index. So part of the exercise tonight, when we described it as a research screening, was also to start indexing, inventorizing some materials that are useful towards a broader conversation. And that will take some shape and form as an archive, as well as will grow. So where is it? This is going down. Shall I go to main menu? Select a film.
Because I stopped.
So what should we do? Put all of the list of films? Maybe we can do.
Sorry.
Should we try?
Yeah, but it's very close. Let's leave that.
If this goes through. How many are there? Skip this one.
Sorry, the part I selected the part at home, but it's quite in the back, and it obviously. But now, yeah. I can't see where we are at the moment.
Okay.
Like in terms of time code.
Engendré par la photo. Je voudrais séparer l'oreille de son maître cinématographique, l'œil. Je veux plaquer sur une pellicule une masse hurlante, sans rapport.
Sorry guys, I will try to show it tomorrow. It's basically, I wanted to show, I selected that because of Philip Parino's work, The Invisible Boy, made in 2000-something, is really taking up that technique of drawing on the actual surface, and it's quite an interesting counterpoint, seeing that piece from 1951. So I try to show that extract tomorrow because it's, I think, quite essential in relation to Parino's work. Okay. So this is an extract from Vertigo, Hitchcock film, 1958, animation within the feature. Okay. Any comment? Then the next one is Felix the Cat. First episode from 1959, which was John extract. Only one episode.
God, actually,
No,
Sorry?
looks like that looks like a
it's 20s,
20s.
isn't it?
Oh,
There's two kind of, it's got two lives, the later version of Felix.
well, the
but this-
first appearance of Felix the Cat was in 1919,
Yeah, this looks like one of those earlier ones.
and the first episode is 1959. Yeah. So, strange, no. Anyhow, sorry.
Okay.
What's going on down there?
Felix's tale, which sort of crosses between the kind of animated world and the sort of drawn world, so it can pull down a drawn tree and things like that, is going to return. I suppose most recently it's been sort of mobilised by Mark Leckey, and we'll see his flicks maybe later. But also I think there's something that captured the imagination around Leckey's use of Felix as the initiator of a media age, because it was a Felix statuette that was used for some of the first TV broadcasting in the US, and also Felix the cat becoming this marketable, commodifiable thing. So this little kind of blotches of black and white animation then becoming statues and toys, soft toys and badges and all that sort of merchandise, which is part of its kind of other journey through a more substantial world.
I don't know if this is the first Felix cartoon with a soundtrack, but this has a soundtrack from Vitaphone, and hence all of the meowing, I think. You normally just get a piano soundtrack with Felix, but all of that noise that you get on this. So I don't know my Felix well enough to know whether this is one of the first with a soundtrack, but I think it's an early example of it. So I think that's part of what it's doing as well. It's kind of pitching itself in the beginnings of the sound, very early stages of the sound era, because was it Steamboat Willie was 1928 as well? And this was released in 28. So they're competing, I guess, with each other for that new marketplace.
Yeah, although it's a very different kind of soundtrack,
Yeah, it is,
isn't it? Because
completely,
it's quite kind of
Bit hit and miss.
yeah, it's sort of wobbly and yeah, it's not doing that whole the Mickey Mouse thing, that whole sort of brilliant timing of image and sound.
It plays with the. There's a play with plausibility that animates both, isn't there? It's a bit like a recognisable meowing, but it also isn't. The way in which the tail kind of hovers between the drawing and the almost plausibility of an illusion space.
Yeah.
And that seems really suggestive.
It is
this
in between thing.
the self-allegorical mode versus the almost believable narrative thrust and story, all framed through an exotic setting, which is
Well, I'd
resonated
also
through the different materials.
like to know what that fascination for this fantasy of Arabia is, which is also, Popeye does it. I mean, there's just loads of it in this period, and it's something I suppose about storytelling and Arabian Nights and the home of a certain kind of magical storytelling, it seemed to be, but it's also obviously racist and stereotypical too, and those tropes, what it can mobilise as to be understood about what it would mean to be in so-called Arabia.
I was just going to say, with regard to this Felix cartoon, when Pat Sullivan starts to sort of commercially exploit Felix and takes it away from Otto Messner's vision, and they add sound and they turn it into toys and so on, it's a sort of pale imitation of the earliest silent cartoons, where Felix is much more of a kind of ideogram. He can detach his ears and the tail comes off and the body breaks apart, and he functions much more experimentally. He's much more in the tradition of the kind of out the inkwell idea, that you've got a kind of homunculus or a kind of golem that can be broken apart and added together and so on. And by the time this is happening and all the animation studios are following Disney's lead, that disciplined body of Mickey Mouse that never breaks apart, that never succumbs to kind of damage, becomes the standard that sort of reverberates through all other animated bodies.
I mean, is it fair to read Felix then in this instantiation also as a stand-in for the animator? If you read it along those lines, if Felix as a figure has consolidated itself, it undoes, takes the beard of the guy on the floor, kind of picks up the palm tree and so forth. It might be another figure by which he becomes a stand-in for the animator and their capacity of orchestrating this world that he himself is then exempt from, as somebody who remains intact.
One of the big contexts is also the decline of the Chaplin films in the sound era. Silent era actors like Chaplin, who exposed themselves to incredible kind of dynamic dangers on the screen. As they decline in the animated world, the animated body is sort of subjected to a same conservatism.
Maria Lasnik, Chairs, 1971.
Lucas, eat your heart out.
What's that?
I was thinking Sarah Lucas echoes backwards.
Last Nick was earlier.
Yeah, not exactly.
That's Steiner and Rudi Vasulka, an extract from Noise Fields from 1974. The whole version is 11 minutes, but we do only a little bit.
Corey Archangel was talking at the Whitechapel on Saturday about his work, and he was talking about coming from Buffalo and the way in which the Vasulkas, Paul Sharits, and a whole generation of people were all in Buffalo at the same time teaching, and that this kind of flicker film, direct film, this particular way of dealing with video has a kind of concentration in Buffalo, in the university scene and in the kind of studio scene of the city, and that he, growing up in Buffalo, took it for granted that this was kind of like, you know, what you did in high school art, you know, kind of just experimenting with video. So it's interesting how much, particularly in the case of sharats and the vasulkas, they're sort of connected in a very specific time and place in their practice.
Interesting. We will also show a Korea painter piece in a bit, so maybe that's a nice link to see what he's doing there. This is Jean Peller, liquid crystals.
This is from, is it 78?
That's 78.
I chose this because I just finished writing a book on liquid crystals, so I'm particularly fascinated by them. But for me, I find it interesting. There's a celluloid film of this process, which is the technical process which is going to displace celluloid film. It's going to become the mechanism which enables liquid crystal display devices of their various types to develop. But also, I mean, I perceive liquid crystals as an animate form, or as a natural animated form, or if one can say as such, because this is them going through their various phases through the input of energy sources, be it usually heat or electrical impulse, as in our devices. And Panleve, of course, had been making films for a while by this point, but is known as a sort of surrealist biologist. Can't make it up.
I also wonder how when we watch those things, if we watch it in low res or high res resolution, what it makes an actual quite a difference as well. So the modes of perception, readings. The next one is Miyazaki, extracts from Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind from 1984. It's the trailer, the official trailer.
に覆われ巨大生物オウムが支配する滅亡寸前の未来世界。清らかな風の吹く風の谷に心優しい少女ナウシカがいた。人類は残り少ない資源を争って戦い合い、そのためにオウムの力を利用しようとしていた。オウムを怒らせない。オウムが怒ると世界は滅びる。 後のすべてを慈しむナウシカの愛と勇気が燃え上がる。詩純な愛と冒険にあふれたスペクタクルロマン、風の谷のナウシカ。
That, of course, being anime before it becomes a kind of concept for Western European consumption, I suppose, and being part of that. One of Miyazaki or Studio Ghibli's films that focus on these themes that are recurrent in almost, all of them. Ideas of flying, of environmental destruction, of a female lead who's on a sort of journey of discovery, and so on. But it also, it's also one of the templates, isn't it, for Cameron's Avatar later as well, the way in which the toxic forest is shown become a model for his work subsequently. So it's kind of lots of returns and echoes and ghostings and repetitions and recyclings perhaps going on.
This is William Forsyth, Avoidance. One introduction. It's one part of his improvisation technologies, a tool for analytical dance eye from 1999.
Approaching a line with a spiral brings up the question of avoidance. In avoidance, you establish a line in space, let's say here, and you avoid the line. You move around the line. You establish its substantiality, and you move your body, you avoid the line with your body, but thereby establishing presence of the line. If the line would be here in space, then I would go maybe like this, underneath it. Or I would, in some cases, probably, I'm getting older here, jump over.
So there are lots online, if you're up to that kind of sculptural stuff. And, as you can see, it's really kind of a volume. Series of volumes. This is on DVD. It's Edgar Pierre.
This is Pierre Huyghe. This is twofold. On one hand, it speaks to the Anne Lee project, which people may be aware of. It's a project that was inaugurated by Philippe Parreno and Pierre Huyghe, was then commissioned out to people like Liam Gillick and Dominic Gonzalez-Foerster and others. So a certain set of 90s people working in a rather disenchanted way with animation technologies, new digital media. It's interesting, in addition to that, insofar as there's a just keep it playing, it's fine, 17 minutes. A couple of things are interesting. Curatorially, it's interesting insofar as the Anne Lee project is, to my knowledge, the first exhibition ever bought by a museum rather than a series of discrete artworks. The Van Abbe board purchased the Anne Lee project by means of an exhibition, which seems somewhat quirkily interesting in its materiality. And this one is the official, I guess, wasn't merchandising so much as press material issued out of the French Pavilion in Venice in 2001 when Pierre Huyghe installed the Turing's Castle, Chateau de Turing, including a series of works. Anne Lee walking through a landscape. The most on the money immediately is, of course, the Anne Lee character, animation character walking through a landscape that is transcoded from the voiceover. So the voiceover is transcoded into a series of graphic landscape lines figurations that Anne Lee walks through. But it's also interesting insofar as Pierre Huyghe, both in the DVD as well as in the installation itself, to my mind, gives a really useful inventory of the different registers on which animation plays out. It's both the way in which the exhibition architecture is animated, the way in which a visitor animates the spatial offering by walking through it, inhabiting it. There are mirror doors which or mirrored mirror inserts into doorways, which are called blinking doors, which sometimes let you look through one way then the other. There's a ceiling light that has to do with Atari game console activations, which is a generational moment. Grands Ensembles, which is a video work, I guess, by Pierre Huyghe. And what I'm interested in was in the DVD is also the way in which that is staged as a semi-nonchalant walkthrough that plays off the different registers of the animation. And there are in this sub-documentary format, there you'll see some of the black and white, really harshly pixelated versions are the outside real space, as it were, environments, which then lead to the colored and higher resolution versions of these inside spaces, which then sometimes become frontal clips of the works in question. So there's a way in which the curatorial, the architectural, the installed, and the sighted play off the different degrees of animation that are inherent in the pieces themselves. Which, of course, if anybody saw Pierre Huyghe's most recent series of exhibitions in Cologne and other places, in Paris, I mean, it's something that he, of course, plays off. The other thing that we could have shown but couldn't because we didn't have it and Pierre was too busy was his Host in the Cloud, which in a way performs this semi-fictional inhabitation by means of inhabiting an actual museum space and playing through the puppetry, as it were, by which the question as to who's a protagonist, who's an extra, who's a prop, who's material, and so forth is redistributed by means of an overall choreography. I mean, also maybe to say that I'm vaguely kind of interested in testing out this notion of the post-internet and post-digital by reflecting it back by some 20 years to see how that resonates with earlier practices that understand themselves as coming out of first digital media. Liam Gillick made similar claims back in the mid-1990s. Tomorrow we'll have a 1-hour contribution by Miltos Manetas, who kind of performs this in relation to Neen and internet memes and so forth. So it's also an attempt to think back by 15, 20 years, you know, as to who new these claims around post-internet practice actually are and how they resonate with earlier practices. At the time configured really around post-relational, post-production, and a vested interest in the sub-curatorial, as Liam calls it at the time. And I mean, somewhat, possibly coincidentally, but not entirely, what happens here, which is another strand of our conversation, is the uncontainedness of animation. You know, it's no longer picturing technology exclusively, or it's one that resonates across different registers of experience and inhabitation and spatiality, and that seems very polemically put forward in Pierre Huyghe's work at the time, and I think is another strand of conversation for tomorrow also. You know, so the lights here resonate with the Atari lights in the actual exhibition space that can be activated by spectators and so forth.
It's the soundtrack in the exhibition
The
space.
soundtrack, you know what, I've been trying to recall, I don't think the sound was through the entire space. I think this is overlaid onto the DVD, you know, kind of as a real suggestion as to the artificiality of this not quite documentation of it. But I think that's another strand. I think it was very helpful with the examples so far. Also, what role does sound or music respectively play for this? You know, if you think about the way in which Liam Gillick's soundtrack animates Sarah Morris's pieces, for instance, you know, I think there's another conversation as to the I guess, sightedness and spatial register, where this experiential animation takes place, and to which extent it's contained or uncontained in the offering. And I guess what's nice in this, as well as in the NLE project overall, is the logic by which. So this is one of the sections of walkthrough, as it were, which goes black and white and leaves the pavilion architecture, so goes out into the real world, as it were, and then goes back in. There's something really explicitly more found object than ready-made, and there's a sense of the cultural detritus, the debris of what seemed the promise of a new digital set of possibilities. And I'm very interested in this disenchanted nonchalance, this indifference as to the promises, the kind of somewhat latent modernist promises of these technologies, and how that plays out in that cluster of people, for the purpose of our conversation now contained within the NLE project. But there's an atmospheric quality, an attitudinal quality that I'm very interested in as part of this conversation.
Do you think this idea of disenchantment and how it relates to an idea of disinterestedness, a sort of disinterested flaneur moving through a sort of series of spaces, do you think there's an element in contemporary art using animation, using this kind of trash pop culture, of a defensiveness, like a cultivated disinterest, like we're drawing upon this but we don't want to deploy it?
I mean, I think that's is one of the questions I'm certainly very curious about how that plays out here. You know, I think that there are moments when I think that are really victim to this fetishization. You know, there is stuff that we can recycle, you know, in a really odd avant-gardist notion of the ready-made, you know, as if that transition were in itself meaningful or indeed desirable. I mean, I'd like to try and think when this NLE project wasn't differently engaged in the materiality, you know, but that only works for me, and that's why I'm interested in this DVD release, if the materiality of those technologies is itself uncontained. You know, the curatorial, the way, which is why it matters that this was bought as an exhibition rather than as a series of discrete artworks. But there seems to be some sense of it is that Levmanovich moment, you know, of transcoding as a new kind of language in database architectures and so forth, which I guess this set of people were trying to play out across the competencies of the artist, the curator, the collector, the connoisseur, and so forth. And I mean, there's something blasé about it, but I think it stops short of fetishizing both the materialities and the technological possibilities. And that I'm interested in how that maybe resonates with some of the more recent post-internet claims or rhetorical assumptions. This is the NLE character, of course, which was, don't know whether people are familiar with the project, I guess most people aren't, which was bought as a secondary anime character from a Japanese animation agency by Pareno and Weig for what seemed like very little money indeed at the time in terms of art world economies, and was then enhanced, as it were, animated by these commissions, so was handed over to different artists who became the enhancers and animators of this NLE character. NLE, no ghost, just a shell, so this empty vessel, as it were, of a secondary character, which took on a life of its own through various instantiations. Joe Scanlon built a Snow White coffin from IKEA furniture for NLE. She was finally handed over back to the character in a firework display for the first ever Art Basel Miami Beach. Yeah, so there's a play with the art market, and also that transition of contemporary art as a highly marketed, industrialized phenomenon. People like Jorge Pardo and others, there's a game around design, you know, the objectification of design also.
That the moon landing tests were filmed.
I think it also has to do with otaku as a breakthrough concept in the mid-2000s in the West, something that we were discovering in the West in a millennial moment, which had had its moment in 80s Japan, but had kind of taken its time to ripple through. It's a sort of an audience-centricness in the obsession with the object.
You think that's mid-2000s?
Like it's otaku going mainstream in art discourse.
Sorry? David, is it?
Yeah.
David was suggesting that otaku also has something to do with this. Can you say a bit about otaku?
Yeah, otaku is a Japanese term that refers to a kind of obsessive consumption. The idea of being an obsessive fan of Japanese animation, an obsessive fan of manga comics and so on, that you would forensically collect every tiny detail and so on. And Thomas Lamar has written this really excellent thesis in his book, The Anime Machine, which talks about the way in which the otaku mentality is also a kind of a perception. It's not just a subjectivity, it's a perception. And we see for the detail. We consume animation for its detail. The way a movement, a costume detail, a kind of the minutiae of the thing. And what's interesting about that world is that Volker Grasmuck has called it the joyful life of empty form. It's a kind of like soulless, detail world. A world of just kind of outlines in exactly this way. And I think that's what this is riffing off in a way. But crucially, the otaku concept came in a big way in the late 80s. It's kind of post-bubble Japan subjectivity. But it took a long time to go mainstream in the West as a concept. It took a long time to penetrate the conceptualizations of media consumption in the West.
Just briefly to explain this, this is the moment where Anne Lee walks through a landscape generated by a visualization of the voiceover that speaks to her. So the landscape is generated, as it were, through is the transcoding of the sound. I mean, otaku, I remember like in Belgium and France, it gained outward notoriety around the mid-1990s or so may have been somewhat earlier. It's more recently then been blurred into these, let's call them diagnosed pathologies around withdrawal symptoms, the isolation of, mainly male kind of late teenage subjects in Japan and so forth. But originally it was somewhat oscillating between a subcultural fetish, a kind of symptomatic of a broader economic situation. Really interesting, but it had this involvement with detailed fascination and technology, right? The construction of world containers to be inhabited by one at a time, which seemed really, really suggestive there.
The word originally comes, it's an old word for house, and the idea of housebound is kind of crucial to it. But theorists in Japan, like Hiroki Azuma, have become really interested in this idea of becoming animation. The idea that through just like incredible immersive consumption of animation to the detriment of everything else, you kind of become anime, become the character, live your life completely immersed. And of course, like contemporary debates around VR and so on, they're suffused with the fear of that otaku subjectivity, which is seen as very post-human.
Yeah. And I mean, it also resonates, I guess, which is why I'm thinking next, I'm just trying to reconstruct the kind of history of this. I mean, it resonates with, I guess, early Mariko Mori work from the early 1990s. There is a way in which, I guess, Chao Fei revisits some of these tropes, both in her utopian proposition, but also in the cosplayer series. And it's interesting how sometimes it really is understood as an aesthetic phenomenon, and then again it's read as symptomatic of a series of social conditions.
It's interesting, actually, Murakami's superflat thesis, which sort of epitomizes it, has real parallels with what Esther was saying about Lotte Reiniger and surface, and this idea that the socio-political pressures of the period are reflected in this kind of escapist surface obsession, this sort of flatness, which is precisely the thesis that Murakami has with regard to superflat. This idea that Japan in a perpetual decline, self-obsessed, the atomic bomb still casting this immense shadow. What can we do but kind of fetishize this infinitely large flatness of our trivial pop culture?
Okay. Yeah.
What's the DVD that's on?
That is, it's called Pierre Huyghe, the Chateau de Turing, so Turing's Castle, and it was released on the occasion of Pierre Huyghe doing the French Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2001. I don't know whether it's distributed by other means. I remember I picked it up then. Right? I don't know whether it's ever released commercially or otherwise. But it's an artifact, it's a fully blown artifact in response to the proposition of the pavilion. So it's both a tracing and, in a way, an instantiation of the pavilion. In a way, I find quite interesting.
That notion of it being of a particular time that has passed is a crucial one that Corey was coming back to on Saturday, that there was an internet from roughly the mid-90s to the mid-2000s that had an aesthetic and a set of concerns, and that we have moved on from that, and that we now have a different set of obsessions, concerns, iconographies, and that in a way, when we conflate the two, we sort of erase a crucial moment of change.
Absolutely, including that really mid-late 1990s moment of artists playing with these. I mean, there was commissioning agencies like E2 here in London. There were Tomoko Takahashi's work with Perhect. So people really, in a really deliberately banal and disrespectful way, trying to also trace the way in which both some of these procedural possibilities of new digital media resonated with the analog precursors, but also how they, in a way, were fueled by those. So Tomoko Takahashi's word Perhect was a word processing interface that was dysfunctional. So you click cut and it gives you an instruction to print it out, take a pair of scissors, and then paste it the same with glue and so forth. So, and this is a really late 90s, early 2000s moment. And I think that's important if we are, to some extent, automatically invested in writing a history of these conversations and the technologies and their various interferences. I think I'm very interested, I mean, also generationally, but also historically, in precisely that transition and how it zoomed in and out of focus between artistic appropriation and technological mainframe. Yeah.
It's also, sorry to interrupt, I have got a bit of software, so it's not, I can't project, but it's also very much, I mean, there's the 90s kind of internet art, or as it was called often, was also, because, I mean, this is obvious as well, but, was able to kind of intervene in the system in a lot more effective way, or a lot more kind of artisanal ways, if you like, than it's at all possible in the noughties and now. I mean, there wasn't Google, and there wasn't. I mean, these things are so had such an enormous effect on, and it completely kind of meant that in a way it's not. I don't think it's so much just about iconography. I mean, it's much more also about the way it was made and the way it was intervening and the kind of communities that could happen because of that. Because it was sort of, it was avant-garde in the sense that it was it was ahead of the game, but and then the game kind of went somewhere else. But
and it didn't have a metaphysical status. I mean, I was remembering like the 12-year-old once asked a friend of mine a few years back, like in one of these conversations with a grown-up who isn't your parent, you can ask all the questions you never had to ask. The kind of ultimate question wasn't about sexuality, but tell me, Uncle Nicholas, how did you get to the internet before there were computers? Right? And this sense of an ontological status of the internet as that metaphysical realm really wasn't that available in the 1990s. This kind of really qualitative shift towards it being a given matrix in relation to which one can trace just about everything. That really wasn't there in the 1990s.
I think it's also, your point's a crucial one. It's about one kind of opacity, which is, can I use HTML? But ultimately, if I can put something in place and it will be found. One kind of opacity, which is technological competence, being replaced by another kind of opacity, mid-2000s, which is a kind of corporate, the coming down of a kind of corporate curtain and the pushing of the technology behind something, and that the user is left with a highly accessible and user-friendly, but ultimately kind of ineffective, redundant, vestigial sort of internet.
And in that sense, these practices just before that sit in between, say, Paul Davis was talking about this the other day. There is a moment which he identified with the emergence of Macintosh computers, which is the end of the moment when artists have some almost mechanical investment in how things work. You know, so if you want to, there's almost a way in which there's a structuralist engagement with digital technologies, as in how it works, how it's textured, how its linguistics work, and so forth. Then there's a moment as to which shifts to what Paul called the what can it do, right? Which is this, let's call it semi-empowered moment of artists playing with these tools as available components, which then is curtailed by, like you're describing, the algorithmically quantified, you know,
Black
set of
box.
parameters.
Yeah.
You know, and it seems that precisely the Unli project and those similar projects sit in between this structuralist modernist mode and a disenchanted, victimized receiver position, which I think animates a lot of recent practice around this.
There's an interesting moment around 1995 where major animations like Serial Experiments Lane, which was major sci-fi in Japan, Evangelion and so on, films being made about digital culture, about mainframe computers on a large scale and so on, but still being cell animation on celluloid frames filmed off using a traditional film camera and then subsequently output to video and so on. And I remember around 2002, Roy Ascott talking a lot about this notion of a post-digital analog, that culturally we were in the digital and we were thinking in terms of the digital, but the analog was still the apparatus. Evangelion is one of them, big major Japanese animation. Takashi Murakami comes back to it a lot as a kind of master signifier. And also Serial Experiments Lane, Lain. In Murakami's thesis, Little Boy, the big book catalogue, he comes back to them again and again and again, and of course Akira as well, as these major sort of landmarks that take on this incredible contextual meaning.
But it's also important probably to say that Murakami is a product from the West.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, from within the country, and I had a conversation with a Japanese curator friend the other day about him because of his recent show at Moriarty Museum somewhere, that he's really dismissed in Japan.
Oh, absolutely. He's a
I
real
think
outsider.
we also have to be totally aware where our discussion actually takes place and how we refer.
Yeah, he's seen as emblematic of Japanese contemporary art, and yet absolutely isn't. Yeah.
This is a piece by Japanese artist but London-based Hirakizawa, Dwelling, 2002. And that was his MA project.
Where was he, Chelsea?
I think at the RCA, but I'm not totally sure. bit here. It's 9 minutes 21. Kind of getting more airplanes and becoming this kind of swirl. It's no action itself. The next piece is Cory Archangel, which David mentioned earlier. Student of the Bazookas and Chariots at the time, also US. And that's his piece, Super Mario Clouds from 2002.
It's probably worth saying that the way that Cory produces these is to hack the original Nintendo cartridges, physically disrupt the cartridge in such a way that the conventional Super Mario Brothers video game is removed, leaving only the background layer to run perpetually, and then he runs it on an original system, an emulator, depending on the exhibition context. He sort of switches up the way that he presents the work, and that subsequently this was the earliest one that he did, but subsequently he's done a number of them, like Hogan's Alley. He put Andy Warhol as a character into Hogan's Alley, which is a shooting game, so you can shoot Andy Warhol in the video game.
But important is also about this work that the source code is revealed, so whoever wants to do that can do it actually.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that was part of also that dynamic of sharing this open source politics in a way. So different.
I think that's really interesting because it is a video game and it's part of kind of mass culture. So rarefying it as an art object presents these sort of questions.
And interesting also because this work in particular made him quite internationally known, and now he's represented by Listen Gallery, among other kind of high-end.
I think it's an ongoing question for him. I think he really thinking about what that means to be a major international artist and maintain that politics of kind of sharing. He publishes all the code for his work as kind of source files, which is interesting.
Yeah, that's it. 5 minutes, I think we know how it looks. The next piece is Ghost in a Shell, Innocence, just an extract, another anime from 2004 by Mamoru Oshii.
Is it not playing? Or?
I thought I pressed something wrong.
Control. Arrived at target airspace. Commencing data relay.
Affirmative 202.
Fill me in.
The perpetrator killed the owner a few minutes ago at the first crime scene, then ran off. He was called in anonymously. At the second crime scene down that back alley, 2 cops were ambushed and killed. All access points are blocked. We'll storm in there in a couple of minutes.
Hey! Hold it, he's from Section 9. He's a cyborg cop. It's not healthy to get in his way.
Roger that. E-Police wants us to intervene. They're asking me for a data link.
Section 9 has priority. Tell them their request is denied.
Very short. Extra.
It's interesting how the robot body underneath the robots in Ghost in the Shell 2, they have a sort of Hans Belmer style sort of construction underneath, and I think it's intentional for Oshii that he's sort of evoking that body construction. It's a sort of idea of a malevolent animation, like a kind of an unsettling kind of abject animation, rather than a sort of elan vital, just like positive life force. It's a kind of corrupted animation, which I think which juxtaposes against the overt animation of everything else in the world. Everything else is kind of normative animation, just dogs walking and people walking down the street and so on. And then there are these aberrant animations, these corrupted robots within that world. So he sort of points to a sort of qualitative view of animation, where animation in a way can kind of fall from grace. It can fall into corruption, and it can also be elevated into a kind of sort of Vincent Mosco style, sort of digital sublime.
So I move on to Mark Lecky Flicks from 2008. 2 minutes.
Felix, the flicks, and I suppose flicks, it's that it's referencing as well as Felix being some kind of originatory moment of cinema, originary moment of cinema. It's also the tail becoming the bar between the frames, which is in that Norman McLaren sort of definition where animation resides in the between the two frames. I suppose it's kind of teasing us with that as well as being extremely phallic.
This is Constant Dullard again, the first movie, the waving, and this second piece I selected.
Round like a circle in a spiral, like a wheel within a wheel, never ending.
Want to learn
never
any terms or whatever?
Animation.
Or animation?
Yeah, anime.
Animation.
Image search.
Sorry?
What about an image search for animation?
So they go anti-clockwise as well.
Or a video?
No, I don't know. What would it?
Just go to the or a video. So the video search and just like a video spinning.
I can't do it.
It's coming back, you'll see it in a
It's
moment.
sort of like
What would you like?
I just thought if you did it as a video search, animation but as a video search, sorry, it's a bit kind of
It's a bit tricky.
if you did animation and then you did a video search rather than a
Yeah, I
text
try my
search.
best, but I just can't catch it. Images?
It's a video.
Movies?
It's the top where it
You
lets
click
you
on
all.
video.
Yeah. I just tried. I'll stop it.
This is
That one's funny.
Maybe Max.
I tried. Not easy.
This is on videos, isn't it? That's what
It
this
doesn't
is.
work. Sorry.
It's on it.
It's on it. It's on it.
Ah.
We'll be able to do it.
You have to learn.
You try and get the
flow.
image. You try and, anyway.
That's how it works.
From a pebble someone tosses in a stream, like a clock whose hand.
Okay. So that piece was from 2010. This is Chris Marker. Most of you probably are familiar with La Jetée, Sans Soleil, and this is the last work he made. Ouvra, the movie. An extract from that. It's from 2010.
Is this screen capture from like an actual game that was made?
Yeah, it's in Second Life, it's just a virtual environment.
Oh, like Gmod.
Yeah, and you can log into it.
So it's screen capture.
So you can play that, of course, and yeah, I just showed this extract to give you an idea that what he's doing, and that's also maybe for the session tonight to think about histories, how he embeds again, like how he embeds the artist himself into kind of all kinds of histories, reading himself against the historical canon, perhaps, trying to, or with it.
Comes back as a ghost in as one of the illustrations in Hitler's style is Defense of the Poor Image, is a kind of is a grab of Chris Marker's home, I guess, in Second Life. Uncommented, you know, but somewhat awkwardly poised between the idea of the avant-garde and more circulatory understandings of art practice.
This is an extract from Throne from 1982, 2010. The next extract is Wim Gillick, Dr. Frankenskippy. Edgar, do you want to say anything?
Just again, it's part of the Anne Lee project. What The whole length film was one that was I think the first Tate sculpture commission for the Tate Britain sculpture series. And I guess in line with Liam's practice, he was very interested in working with somebody who was an animator by practice, so to not perform the artist takes animation as a ready-made. I was thinking about co-production with this. Otherwise, there's a lot of the tropes we've seen so far, the exotic, the otherworldly, the utopian proposition, that other realm, which is both elsewhere and non-analog, as it were. This is a very short, don't even know where this comes from, it's a 30-second stock cube version, I guess, of the piece.
This is a revised construction, taking tiny steps, functioning in space idea. Bum bum, ba-da-da-dum.
I guess in the whole thing, there's a narrative around remote island, of course, the character inhabiting this remote island, which is a commentary also on a residency in Japan that had happened just before. So there's again a double or triple play on locations, events, artistic practice, and Lee as a stand-in, as an alter ego for the artist at work, as well as emblematic of the condition of unsightedness and displaced practice of the artist, I guess.
That's a piece from Jean Gerard, an extract from Exercise 2012. Yeah, I don't know much specifically about this piece by Gerard, because I know his grow finish units and the piece that was all about painting the building. I've forgotten about the school now, but so he does these works that often use animation and a lot of compositing of images. So the grow finish units are about these automated pig farms, and he annexes them to real time, and he has a circulating camera, and they sort of last for 1,000 years, kind of thing. So I'm sort of interested in how he uses time and new technologies and composite techniques, and a fascination with sort of real world weather events and so on. I think this is sort of based around training manuals for soldiers. So I suppose we're moving in some ways towards that Ito style territory as well that interests us. And so this sense in which you get people to play out these roles that are that they're trained in to play out in some sense. So it's all around kind of performances and gestures, and which are then locked into agribusiness or military complex or industry in some way. I mean, one of his more recent projects was
trying to get an image of Google headquarters. Commissioned a helicopter to try and take some aerial shots of it, but was not. I can't remember. It was a very difficult trying to secure an image of the behemoth itself. I don't know if anyone else here knows anything more specifically about this.
I thought he did take photographs from outside from helicopters, and then he felt that he wasn't able to go inside.
Yeah, he
and
said
then he made.
But he had to. He couldn't get permission to photograph it. The only way he could do it was to get a helicopter and photograph it from a certain height that Google didn't have jurisdiction over anymore, or something. I think.
Yeah, there's a sort of non-place height, which is below commercial aircraft and sort of above building height, where you can occupy without any legal. It's a bit sort of legally ambiguous.
Right.
Yeah, he photographed the headquarters, but then he wanted to film the server farms, which are just completely utilitarian, but highly protected spaces. The thing that interests me about Jean Gérard within a history of animation is that he's a real. He's in the lineage of Jules Etienne Marais and Muybridge and so on, in that he sees animation for its kind of mechanization and instrumentalization of the body.
Sort of analytical kind of sense, breaking things up.
And animation functions as a kind of recording device, sensor of the world, something like that, and then a kind of display mechanism. It both records and displays.
So it's quite panoptic. I mean, he really does. It's a contemporary panopticon, isn't it? Because it's seeing in all directions, but it's a kind of huge illusion of that possibility of total seeing. So.
It's also interesting, I guess, this shift between the desert and the exotic as a trope so far. Then it's Djibouti, the home of the Foreign Legion, you know. In Hito, again, these are very specifically geopolitically coded locations. So it remains the desert, remains the non-place that needs to be animated. But that animation is now inscribed into a broader geopolitical set of distributions. You know, so it's not in itself, the artistic gesture now competes with other forms of gestures and animations and mechanisms of animation.
The thing that's amazing about that is there are so many Donald Duck cartoons and so on in which Donald Duck is a Foreign Legion trainee, that kind of thing. Yeah. He's in the desert, having to kind of labour to sort of become, and he always fails, of course, you know. It's interesting that the desert as the non-place of animation and games in particular as well.
And then you think about the soundtrack, Claire Denis' Beau Travail, which, you know, there's could be a whole conversation around the desert, but could be interesting. Yeah.
It's a piece by Brazilian artist Rinane Neufander from 2006. The next piece is Schitter Style. How Not to Be Seen, a Fucking Didactic Educational Document File 2013.
How Not to Be Seen. A fucking didactic educational mod file. Lesson 1. There are 4 ways to make something invisible for a camera. To hide. To remove. To go off screen. To disappear. This is a resolution target. It measures the visibility of a picture. This is a resolution target. It measures the resolution of the world as a picture. Resolution determines visibility. Whatever is not captured by resolution is invisible. How Not to Be Seen. Lesson 2. There are 7 ways of making something invisible in plain sight. Pretend you are not there. Hide in plain sight. To scroll. To wipe. To erase. To shrink. To take a picture.
Today, most important things want to remain invisible. Love is invisible. War is invisible. Capital is invisible.
In the 1950s and 60s, the US Air Force installed grayscales and resolution targets in the California desert to calibrate aerial photographs and videos. Resolution determines
I mean, this is online in its entirety. I guess one of the things why, irrespective of the overexposure HETOS received for all kinds of contexts, including this one, for our purposes is important as for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, of course, is the way in which imaging technologies are now understood as inextricably bound up with the military-industrial complex. You know, so there's a sense that imaging technologies are not just imaging technologies, but are produced in line with Paul Virilio's much earlier claims around the carpet bombing being the extension of the aerial photograph and in a way co-produced through it. Ito revisits that, and on one hand, in a way, thinks about images in the moment of drone warfare, you know, so the whole drone logic of the visible and impact of military technology is important for this. But then also deploys some of these imaging technologies herself as part of an artistic inventory of tools that compete somewhat awkwardly with a military application or deployment of those. And it seems interesting in line with the overall argument today that the slapstick comes back in, the clown, the slapstick comes back in, but under very different terms, you know, as a return to an earlier mode of deployment of these imaging technologies that pretends to be able to be in a position to topple the industrialized deployment of these. And that sense of tension is both an allegorical play around the finger of the artist, as well as, I guess, a test case as to what, you know, what the role of humor, irony, and so forth might be in view of these otherwise over-identificatory templates by which she, of course, understands herself as fully compatible with and embedded in these infrastructures, these industrialized infrastructures. There's something around the sites in the desert comes back, but as a abstract, but also nuclear, and in a post-military site, which is never neutral, to the contrary. You know, so in a way, she kind of is certainly there at a moment where all these different conversations intersect.
Maybe I want to also refer to talking about the desert. There's this beautiful film a film about, made from Kobo Abe's novel Women of the Dunes. Maybe that's worth seeing. I can't show it today, but that also catches. It's not an animation, but in a way it can be probably analyzed as being one. It's really worth watching that. Maybe tomorrow there's a chance of looking briefly into that in comparison, or not in comparison, but in the overall setting of animation in a more literal sense. This is only a very short extract from one of at the moment, the most current and international young Chinese animation artists. He makes really kind of laborsome and huge installations. So this is a super tiny glimpse.
Are they multi-screen installations? Really?
Partially.
Like Tabaimo, kind of like.
It depends on the work as well. This is titled What Happened in the Year of Dragon. It's from 2014.
These, I guess, are clouds again.
Clouds again.
Clouds.
Yeah,
Clouds being
back.
something we want to think about tomorrow. Clouds as animate forms, and clouds as Got clouds in there, many senses, from pictorial clouds to data clouds and so on. Something that might be thought about fruitfully in relation to questions of animation.
I drop this. It's selected films by Martin Arnold, catching up on Disney histories, for keeping for tomorrow in the ghost section, hopefully. This is a work again, like from a different. It's from India, New Delhi-based Gigi's career. That's part of a big installation at the moment in the States called Time. And this particular work is called Arc, and they're from 2015. Yeah, stop it here. You can see it's a very strange hybrid body of all kinds of parts in a way, and also catches again maybe the cloud reappears also in his work, right, in terms of the environment and current concerns. And history, obviously, symbols of time, historical time. Migration is one of his bigger subjects as well, but the whole question of time, all its facets. And again, like animation in his work is only one small part, so it's a multimedia installation, and he sees the animation as some sort of extended painting. And the last bit for today is family photography.
This is a very banal image in a sense, as a cinematic experience. Very banal, but what it's doing is it's a recent development that's been able to capture light as it moves across an object. Although, is this running at a really slow?
It's not running yet.
It's not running at all.
Sorry, I thought I should.
And it's taking 1 trillion frames a second, but then having to recomposite them so as if it's one single beam of light moving across an object, but it's not. It's a compositing out of those trillions and trillions of frames. So in that regard, it's a kind of animation of the passage of light across an object and slowing down. I don't remember the speed at which light moves, but slowing that down or stretching it out so that we can see it. So we can now separate the shadow, Lotte Reininger's shadow, from its object. I think it's quite an interesting place to be in image terms. But of course, I mean, galvanizing that military theme, again, what they hope it enables the military to do is to see around corners, to see the enemy before it's actually visible. This is one of the applications of it.
Maybe Harun Farocki comes to mind here, which we haven't looked at all, strangely enough. Interesting artist. Also, his history again, working in this on social realist films in the 70s in German. Maybe Anke knows his work. I don't know, but.
I guess part of what was interesting tonight, I would say, is to see overlaps, but also to suddenly realize where the gaps, kind of the blatant omissions and what isn't, and which. And I guess what will tomorrow will be slightly different from this somewhat indulgent format of tonight, insofar as we have these thematic sessions that will really try and unpick or maybe at least collect some of the vocabularies around these materials. We frame this in terms of the notion of the glossary, but really trying to start inventorizing, which terms, memes, concepts, notions might be useful for an expanded vocabulary around animation. So we have these 4 sessions which are thematic-ish, they're organized. I think they'll all be slightly different. There'll be some live contributions from other places.